portions of their historical range, while celebrating the active efforts of conservation groups to restore a continuous population of these charismatic creatures and other missing elements along the Pacific coast. We also recognize that sea otters have influenced the livelihoods, the culture, and spiritual aspects of coastal communities throughout human history, and many of these communities have their own words for sea otter, including the few that appear in the inner ring of this year's logo. That also want to touch on that this week is highlighting Sea Otter Savvy's We Were Here Sea Otter program, which educates communities and stakeholders who are missing sea otters and offers a survey for community involvement. So the Southern Sea Otter Range is currently from Gaviota State Park in the south to Año Nuevo State Park in the north, and sea otters did once inhabit all along the Pacific coast. They are ecologically and culturally significant, and there's increasing discussion regarding possible reintroduction to historical habitats, which is why you guys are here for this talk. To move forward, government agencies and the sea otter research community need to engage communities and stakeholders to hear from their perspectives. So if you're wondering what you can do today, please do take the Sea Otter survey if you haven't already and share your thoughts on possible reintroduction. Your voice matters. The links, the website, and the survey will all be made available to you through the chat. I think at the end as well, we posted with this video. So now I would like to introduce Andy Johnson, who is a sea otter expert and the California representative with Defenders of Wildlife. Take it away, Andy.
Yeah. And there's the slide I should have advanced to talk about the survey. But yeah, happy Sea Otter Awareness Week, everyone. And I'm going to talk a bit about this, I think, a cool project that we've been working on, conceptual planning for Southern Sea Otter Reintroduction. There's no formal program yet, but it's something we've been thinking about for quite a while. And we wanted to present some of what we've been working on to you this evening. And I threw this subtitle in, the madness begins, because if you have been at all involved in any sort of reintroduction planning effort for species reintroduction, it's absolutely insane. Just the level of detail, the complexity of it all. I'll try to convey some of that as we talk about tonight, but it's quite an undertaking. So here we go. So I'm going to talk about a couple things. I'll give you a little bit of a sea otter history and status. I think if you have an interest in sea otters, you probably know some of that already. But I want to talk a bit about why we would think about reintroducing. And the project we're really working on is focused on southern sea otters right now, sea otters in California. And why is now a good time to be considering this? I'll talk about our conceptual planning process, what we're actually doing, how we're going about it, and what it could lead to. And I want to talk a bit about this idea of rewilding, which is kind of a bigger picture view, not just looking at single species restoration, but how do we look at our coastal ecosystems and think about restoring them as well. And then talk about some next steps, like what comes after our conceptual planning process and so forth. But first, just a quick introduction to me. I've been working with marine mammals for about 44 years in oceanariums and out in the wild. So quite a long time, lots of marine mammal rehabilitation work with pinnipeds and sea otters and some cetaceans and manatees and so forth. When I wasn't working for a company, I did some consulting and did consulting work around the world with marine mammal stuff. And before I started work at Defenders of Wildlife, I spent 20 years at the Monterey Bay Aquarium managing the Sea Otter Research and Conservation Program there. So quite a lot of work with marine mammals. This is my I don't know if it's my only silly slide, but so in short, I spent 44 years supporting marine mammals. Here's my picture of me supporting a marine mammal. So this California sea lion was not excited to be up there, but hey, it was 40 years ago. So at any rate, Southern sea otter history and status. We've got our beautiful California coastline. This area depicted here along the Big Sur coast is very important for southern sea otters, and I'll get into that. But I think this idea of I call it unmaking sea otters, like how did we get to where we were in the early 20th century, where we essentially removed all sea otters, almost all sea otters from the world. There was a discovery that sea otter fur was thick and insulative, and the fur industry took off in the mid 1700s, and in a very short time worked its way around the Pacific Rim from Russia to Alaska and down eventually to California and Baja. And it was remarkably efficient, but and all sorts of stories related to it. I think this graph, you don't have to look at it in too much detail, but from the mid 1700s, in a very short amount of time, you can see just in exported skins from California, in 60 years, a little over 60 years, a big peak, and then down to where they almost weren't getting any skins out of California anymore. So just remarkably efficient at going out and hunting and killing all the sea otters and getting those furs. And obviously sea otters couldn't keep up. From estimates of upwards of 300,000 animals ranged around the Pacific Rim, probably that number got knocked down to about 2,000 in just a very few remnant groups, and only maybe a few dozen in California remained. So here's kind of the historical range, the green pathway, almost an unbroken chain of sea otters from let's see, can I use my little laser pointer here? From about halfway down Baja and all the way around through Russia, through the Aleutian Islands to the Commander Islands, the Kamchatka Peninsula, and down into northern Japan. I think they're seeing a few otters trickling back into northern Japan now, but the remnant groups were sort of in these areas where all the otters were gone except for a couple of spots, and you can see this big gap between the little group in California and central Alaska. So amazingly, really no sea otters left from California to central Alaska. Incredible. And here's sort of what we have now. You can see there's animals extending through Russia, back up the southwest and central and southeastern Aleutian Islands, through central Alaska. And then we have populations that were reintroduced. Animals were captured from the Aleutian Islands and brought to this area in southeast Alaska, to the west coast of Vancouver Island, and to the northern part of Washington State. And so those animals did well. There was a reintroduction effort into Oregon that didn't take, and then we have our little group here that's expanded from small populations. So we still have this large gap where sea otters haven't returned. So I mentioned before that initial slide of our Big Sur coast. We have this Bixby Creek Bridge, and when that was being constructed, that was sort of the officially recognized time when it became obvious to all that there was sea otters still alive along the Big Sur coast. The locals seemed to know about the animals well before then. There were documentation that there were animals in the area, but really until people started driving back and forth along the coast, it wasn't really common knowledge. But from these groups, the otters we have today in California descended. There were protections put into place in the early 20th century. The first Seal Act of 1911 essentially dealt with all fur-bearing animals that kind of hang around the ocean. So the Russians and all the way through to down to here, the United States and others signed this agreement to stop hunting these animals to extinction. Wasn't viewed as a good thing. And then we sort of jumped forward. The next, another big protection was the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972. And then the next year, the Endangered Species Act, the U.S. Endangered Species Act of 1973, came into effect. And that was particularly relevant for sea otters because they were listed as threatened in 1977. So 46 years they've been listed. The population's grown. They've expanded their range from that little group in Big Sur, but we still have a ways to go. And we're marking the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act. There's can't remember if we're linking that or not, but you can go to Defender's website or just look up 50th anniversary of the ESA. I know that all the governmental agencies and other groups are highlighting that, trying to talk about success stories with species conservation and so forth. So sea otters have benefited from the ESA as well as many other species. Now I've got my little, we talked about unmaking sea otters. So I always try and show this video from the Monterey Bay Aquarium about making sea otters. So the sea otter that came into the tide pool area by the aquarium and hopped out on a rock and gave birth. So the status of southern sea otter population, as I mentioned, has expanded quite a bit. We know this because obviously people see sea otters up and down the coast, but in the early 1980s, there was a really focused effort to try to count how many sea otters there were, to document how they were expanding their range and so forth. And those protocols have stayed in effect essentially until today, going out with spotters along the shore, counting the otters, how many otters do I see in this area, moving to the next area, and then sending a plane up as well to get aerial counts, and then putting it all together and coming up with some numbers. As of 2019, the mainland population was declining. So it sort of, the population, let's see, how would you see this? The population had been going up for about a century with a few little dips here and there. But as of 2019, we were seeing this downward trend again after the population reached about 3,000 animals. There was a population that was translocated to San Nicolas Island in the late 1980s. That population stagnated for a long time, but as of 2019 was trending upward considerably. And then since 2019, there have been no complete counts because of the pandemic and other logistical challenges. People, just weren't getting out there to swap their COVID germs, and then other logistical problems came into play once people were allowed to go out again. But so incomplete counts were done in 2021 and 2022. Those aren't comparable to the protocols that have been in place for so long. And the count that was done in May, I don't think was really a complete count. We might see some results. I was hoping by a Sea Otter Awareness Week, but haven't heard anything from the U.S. Geological Survey. But the counts of the population involve the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Geological Survey, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Monterey Bay Aquarium, and several other groups that get out there and count these otters every year. So keep hoping we can get back to getting some accurate numbers, because with the population trending downward in 2019, no one has a real idea about what the population's been doing. So we'd like to get a handle on that. Here's just sort of a graphical representation of the counts. You can see, so I got my laser. You can see since the early 80s, some definitely going upwards with some dips. This dip here seemed really connected with a lot of infectious disease and contaminants that were going into the ocean. Population started up again. We saw this other dip, which seemed to be associated with an increase in white shark bites. And then really saw a big increase. And there's some interesting thinking about that. About the time when we saw real degradation along our coastline in terms of sea star wasting disease and warming waters, and the overgrowth of sea urchins, for a time there, the sea otters really took advantage of that. They were chowing down on purple sea urchins, and the population numbers really seemed to jump up. But then that tapered off as the sea urchins ate up all the kelp, and they became unnutritious, I guess is the way to say it. for the sea otters, and that may be why we've seen this dip over the last few years leading up to 2019. So, but you can see with San Nicolas Island, stagnant population for quite a long time, but finally some upward movement. Initially, they released about 140 animals at San Nicolas Island in the northern Channel Islands. In California, it was down about a dozen animals for several years, and they're getting back close to the number that was released. So it's taken a long time to establish that population. And but we really want to get a handle on what's going on with the sea otter population in California, because there are some concerns. Just quickly, why sea otters are important. I think most folks will know about keystone species. Sea otters and many other species have a really large effect on their environment. They just seem to, we see it a lot with predators, but not all keystones are predators. But sea otters have that top-down effect in the system that really has strong effects on, and generally positive effects on that population. A related term is an umbrella species. You know, if sea otters are healthy, generally a lot of animals that live in that ecological community are doing pretty well. They're a flagship in as much as groups like Monterey Bay Aquarium, Defenders of Wildlife, Sea Otter Savvy, we use this species as just to talk about the importance of wildlife conservation. This sea otters are a good flag carrier for taking care of our natural systems. And sea otters, on the sort of flip side, are an indicator species. If sea otters aren't doing well, we generally know that that there's something unhealthy in the ecosystem. And so with the sea otter population that's trending downward, we have a pretty good idea about what's been going on in the ecosystem, because sea stars died off, the water warmed, the kelp went away by either sea urchin devoured all the kelp, or for other reasons, warming waters. And so the sea otter population declining, we didn't need that to determine that the ecosystem was experiencing problems, but we have seen other times where sea otters, because they live in that nearshore area, they'll tend to show things like, hey, a lot of contaminants are getting washed into the ocean. We're seeing a spike in disease in sea otters. That generally means that a lot of nasty stuff has been going in the ocean and probably is having an effect on other creatures as well. So short answer is sea otters are extremely important to the nearshore ecosystem, and we definitely want to see them return to the areas where they used to roam. And so then we get to this question of why reintroduction? Why now? What's going on beyond just the fact that we're a little concerned that the population took a dip the last time we counted it? So here's this little map of sea otter expansion, and you can see this sort of little spot here in sort of the 1930s when the Bixby Creek Bridge was constructed. The little group was found, or recognized worldwide that this group existed in this little area, a few dozen animals. So sea otters definitely reproduced and grew and expanded their range. But by 1998, we see this effect where sea otters kind of made it around Point Conception here, and extended even down to the Gaviota coast, and extended northward up to sort of the Pigeon Point area north of Año Nuevo. And that's where they've kind of stuck. And so for, well, really 25 years now, a quarter of a century, this population hasn't expanded its range, when it was seen to be on a pretty good track up until then. So that's a concern. This little, why did the sea otter cross the road? A big issue that we've seen increasing over the last 15 years has been white shark bites on sea otters. And we see that to the north and the south of this range. And we're pretty sure that that's one of the factors that's limiting sea otter range expansion, that sea otters can't seem to run the gauntlet of white shark bites. We don't call it predation because we don't think the sharks are eating the sea otters. The natural history of white sharks is that they bite something at the surface, whether it's a seal or a surfer or whatever it might be, and then they decide if they want to come back and eat it. And with usually with the surfer, and certainly with sea otters, we believe that the sharks are not impressed by what they've bitten, and they move on. Unfortunately for the sea otters and usually for most people, the bites are a serious issue, and for sea otters, they're often fatal. So if you think about the linear nature of the California coastline, sea otters have to really make a determined effort to swim, for instance, northward and reestablish themselves in a new area. And if they run into something like white shark bites and so forth, it makes it even more difficult. So we think that plays a big role in why sea otters haven't stretched the range beyond where they are now. So big issue, a lot of mortality associated with white sharks. Sea otters aren't expanding. Probably the numbers they've reached within sort of the Central California range is what we call carrying capacity. They've sort of maxed out their numbers in that area. They'll probably go up and down a bit, but we aren't going to see, say, that population double within the zone where they're living. So that's a concern. And as I mentioned, the sea star die-off, the blob, affected these sunflower sea stars, Pycnopodia, and really from Baja all the way around the Pacific Rim, up through Canada into Alaska, almost all these animals died off. There was a withering withering disease that basically these animals just sort of kind of came apart. They just sort of dissolved, and it was pretty horrific. And as in areas where north of where sea otters are now, where there are no sea otters, the sunflower sea star was the only urchin predator into the northern part of the range, or north of the sea otter range. And as the sea stars died off, sea urchins overgrew, overgrazed on the kelp, and the kelp, particularly in Northern California and farther north, has almost entirely vanished, which is, within, only a decade. And it's sort of, you hate to use words like cataclysmic or catastrophic, but really an unbelievable environmental catastrophe to see that much damage and change within the nearshore system. So a huge problem there. And then we know that sea otters have this strong ecological significance, where without sea otters, we tend to see what we see now, which are these urchin barrens. And not in all areas, but generally with sea otters, we see healthy systems with better biodiversity. The animals that rely on healthy kelp forests really improve their status when sea otters are around. So sea otters seem to be relatively important, extremely important, to restoring the coastline that's so degraded. We know that they're ecosystem engineers, we call them, both in kelp forests and in eelgrass beds and estuaries. We've seen dramatic effects that they can have in relatively short periods within these zones. So we feel like, why reintroduction, why now, with a system that's so degraded along the California coast and northward. It seems like getting sea otters back into those systems might be a good idea. And so some of the questions that have come up as we talk about reintroduction or ecosystem restoration. Is there any way to resolve the impact of white shark bites mortality on sea otters? Probably not. But how can we accelerate the sluggish or stymied recovery of sea otters throughout California? There is a mandate that the Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, has to recover the southern sea otter under the Endangered Species Act to get them from threatened to off the list entirely. And we don't think they can recover within the zone where they're at. So we need to think about active management approaches we can take to help the sea otters expand their range and recover. Like I say, expand the range into historical areas where they were. We know that they survived there for millennia, that if we can put them back in some of these areas, maybe they'll do so again. And this idea that we aren't just doing it for the sea otters, that we'd be doing it for the damaged California coastal ecosystems that have deteriorated so rapidly. And one of the biggest issues that raises its head when we talk about moving sea otters into new areas is that there are potential conflicts with the fishing communities that have grown up in the absence of sea otters when sea otters were removed by hunting. A lot of these organisms that we cherish, that we prize for their for eating, abalone and sea urchins and crabs and clams. Those industries grew up in the absence of sea otters. If sea otters were to return, those industries might be somewhat or even heavily affected. And the Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, has management authority and responsibility to recover sea otters. And so, how can we convince them to take action? We think this a passive approach that's occurred over the last, since the early 20th century, of just sort of monitoring how sea otters are doing, might not be the way that's going to see them actually recover an Endangered Species Act. So can we convince the service to take some stronger action? And we think potentially reintroduction is the way to go. So if you follow wildlife conservation, you know that species reintroduction has been used in a number of cases. In California, certainly we have the handsome California condor that has been undergoing restoration, reintroduction, conservation project work for decades. But we have like this little Weasley black-footed ferret, Arabian oryx. I can never. I've heard some people say Przewalski's horse. I've heard people say Krzyzewski's horse, but basically a wild horse in Asia was reintroduced successfully. So there's lots of work that's been done on species reintroduction with the goal of establishing healthy, diverse, sustaining populations where they've been wiped out, and that certainly applies to southern sea otters. So we thought long and hard about what do we do about this. We've talked about reintroduction in the past, but particularly with the pandemic, there was a lot of slowdown in terms of discussions, and we were trying to think about what we should do next. So came up with this idea of conceptual planning. And for the purposes of our work, we didn't use conceptual in the context of abstract or theoretical. We're not. It's not just an intellectual exercise. We really are considering this as maybe we'll call it a cerebral exercise. We're getting a lot of smart people together, but in this context, the Fish and Wildlife Service hasn't adopted a formal approach to reintroduction, so we can't say we're doing a reintroduction planning project. So we're saying it's a conceptual project. That was too much explanation for that, I think. But a lot of work's been done on looking at the feasibility of sea otter reintroduction. The first thing that came out was from a group called the Alaka Alliance in Oregon. Obviously, Oregon has been missing sea otters for since I think the last one was seen there in the early 20th century, but really they were wiped out well before then. So the Alaka Alliance, did a feasibility study for Oregon, determined that sure, it's feasible, but a lot of work is needed. The second image there is of a feasibility assessment that the Fish and Wildlife Service conducted last year. It came out last year after more than a year of work, and that essentially came to a similar conclusion that sea otter reintroduction is feasible, but a lot of work is needed. And we kept thinking, okay, who's going to do this work? And so that we've come up with this idea of the conceptual plan for southern sea otter reintroduction, which we hope will be kind of a bridge that will get a lot of the thinking done so that the Fish and Wildlife Service can adopt and initiate a formal project looking at sea otter reintroduction along the coasts of Northern California and into Oregon. And as I mentioned, restoration to Oregon, the Alaka Alliance is going gangbusters. They did their feasibility study. They've done some economic studies, and they're hiring some science staff. They're working closely with tribal groups. They've really made a lot of progress. And so that sort of feeds into this idea that what we're looking at go back for a second. What we're looking at is a regional effort. We're not just talking about southern sea otters, reintroducing them in Northern California. We're really talking about sea otters need to be restored to basically this gap that exists from south of San Francisco up to central Washington, and about over 900 miles of coastline that's lost its main predator. So we're all working closely together. These aren't individual separate efforts. And just as one intellectual exercise, in the past, translocations of sea otters involved, well, let's go grab a whole bunch of sea otters, move them over here, and kind of see what happens and hope for the best. And generally that's been pretty successful. But when we look at an area like the San Nicolas Island translocation, where 140 animals were moved, but for a long time, decades, a couple of decades, really most of the animals left or died, and this small group persisted for an extended period. When we get to this point here in about year 15, that was when the last Southern Sea Otter recovery plan was published, and that's the Fish and Wildlife Service's template or framework for achieving recovery under the Endangered Species Act. So that's 20 years old. So at that point, this population wasn't doing very well. And just to give you an idea of, here's what they were hoping would happen, was that they would see, population stabilize, start to grow, and then hit carrying capacity, which is kind of the max that San Nicolas Island could hold, after less than 20 years. And that obviously didn't happen. And if we look out farther to roughly where we are now, we see the population has sort of done this, which is, it has kind of taken off, it's done well, but it's still far from carrying capacity. And in fact, it hasn't even reached the numbers that were released there. So if we look at a new reintroduction program, which is essentially a conservation translocation program, we don't want to go down that pathway of moving a bunch of animals, hoping some of them stick, and watching a bunch of them either swim away or die. That's not a viable approach in this day and age. So we'll do something different. And again, as I mentioned, there's regional planning going on. Again, animals are up here in Washington State, animals are here in California, but there's this big gap from south of San Francisco up to central Washington. Nothing in Oregon, nothing in Northern California. An occasional stray will wander up there, almost always a male animal. They might find food, but there are no females up there, and there's nothing they can do, so they swim back or just hang out. But there's no expansion of the range, no reproduction or anything. And I just wanted to mention, looking at all these tribal groups in California along the Central Coast and then up through Northern California, all these coastal tribes in particular have, to a very varying degrees, history with sea otters, long history, some going back 10,000 years, and very important that we investigate and look at the tribal connections to sea otters, the historical and cultural connections, and we're working very closely with tribal groups and more tribal groups as time goes on, because we want to know the cultural importance of the animals to these areas, and so far we've had a lot of good strong responses from tribes in Northern California. And then if we again, just a closer look, and if we look at Northern California going into Oregon, this is sort of the area where we're kind of thinking about reintroducing southern sea otters. So you can kind of keep that in mind. The idea of releasing animals farther south, like down in Southern California and Baja, the thought was that the water is only getting warmer. We probably want to move sea otters more northward, and also trying to connect that, make a connection between the animals in California back to the animals that are up in Washington State. Is there any way we can get those animals to reconnect and start swapping genetics, and that will help the populations become more genetically resilient. We are going much slower than I thought, so I'll speed up. our project funding, there's some of you may know about the California Sea Otter Voluntary Tax Contribution Fund. That generates money through people can donate to that, and money goes to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and to the California Coastal Conservancy. And the Conservancy operates a grant program, the Sea Otter Recovery Fund, and Defenders of Wildlife went after some of that dough. And so we got about $56,000 to work on this conceptual planning process, and we've applied for more money from that fund in 2024, again, to bridge to what we hope will be a formal reintroduction program through the Fish and Wildlife Service. And we also have been working with our partners, the Alaka Alliance up in Oregon. They work closely with the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and we've applied for with the Siletz as the lead, a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant called the America the Beautiful Challenge, which would bring money in over 3 years to really kind of kick some reintroduction projects off. And you don't have to look at this too closely. This is just kind of a schematic of our sort of our regional efforts for reintroduction planning. The take-home message is that we need to get to a decision point with the Fish and Wildlife Service. They need to decide to proceed with something formal. A little bit of a different view here in our California model, but again, we're trying to get to one core endpoint, which is the service considers our conceptual plan, our sort of final report, in its decision making on how to move forward. And if you're familiar with the National Environmental Policy Act, I'll talk about that in a second. But there's a lot of process that the government has to go through to do something like a reintroduction project. But we want to get to that stage where that process begins. And I won't show much of this at all, but we've got quite a number of task teams and groups working together in various committees and work groups on conceptual planning. As you might imagine, it takes a lot of people and experts thinking about things. We're working within sort of the guidelines and the information through the IUCN, the Species Survival Commission. There's a conservation translocation specialist group. So they're formal processes for reintroducing wildlife that we want to follow. Again, another chart that you don't have to pay much attention to, but the Monterey Bay Aquarium is funding some mathematical population modeling, which involves all sorts of data sets and looking at the habitat and sea otters and other environmental aspects, and we'll start to feed in some socioeconomic considerations as well, some benefits and impacts that we would see from a reintroduction, and throw it all into a computer model, run it through a bazillion simulations, and it'll spit out some answers for us. It's not quite that simple, but we're going through that process as well. As I mentioned, the IUCN has guidelines for reintroductions and conservation translocations, so we want to make sure we adhere to international standards. And I won't go, the whole issue with fisheries conflicts is a huge issue, and we have some, I think Heather is helping to moderate discussions through the week with some fishers, with some folks in the aquaculture industry to talk about sea otter reintroduction and the impacts of sea otters on positive and potentially negative on coastal restoration. So we know we need to address the fisheries conflicts and work with the fishing communities to discuss these issues, because we want to, oops, did I just cut it off for everyone? There we go. Does everyone still have the presentation on the full screen?
Yes.
Yes, yeah. Okay. Good. So dealing with, not just dealing with, but engaging the fishing communities in discussions to make sure we're not just butting heads on this. The fishing community generally, the shell fishing industry generally doesn't like sea otters. They feel like sea otters eat them out of house and home. Those of us who feel like sea otters are vital to nearshore restoration and would like to see those systems become more resilient and healthy, we think we can find some common ground, some middle ground, and see if we can find some ways forward. So enough about that. As you might imagine, I would say it takes a village, but I think it takes more than a village. in our conceptual planning process project, we've got, NGOs, state and federal agencies, academic institutions, tribal groups, and so forth. Just trying to include everybody who has a stake in what would occur if sea otters were reintroduced, who's going to be involved in that, who's affected by it, and how do we include them in the discussion. And then I'll just touch briefly on this idea of rewilding, that we want to look bigger than just sea otters. We know that kelp has been wiped out along the coast. Other organisms have suffered, without kelp to eat. People up Mendocino County, they see abalone just, washing ashore dead because there's no food for the abalone. So it isn't a question of whether, hey, if we reintroduce sea otters, they'll eat the remaining abalone. The abalone are dying anyway. The system that can't support that. So really, we're talking about a bigger picture than just single species issues. And there's a lot of just new work. This book just came out on rewilding, and the critical components to rewilding, that we're really looking at species and biodiversity restoration rather than just individual species, trying to restore ecosystem processes and resilience. If we think about things like sea level rise and warming waters, the changes we're likely to see, we need a healthy coastline that can help protect against some of that change. And obviously, something like rewilding takes extensive stakeholder collaboration. If we think, just our little discussions about sea otter reintroduction take a huge group talking about bigger issues, how to collaborate and combine projects is going to involve even more people. That gets into the sort of the madness of all this that I talked about. And then trying to get a shift in people's thinking about how we coexist with wildlife, how we live within these natural systems, how when we have conflicts that we mitigate them successfully rather than just suing each other all the time. We have to deal with some of that, and these rewilding discussions will help us get there, I think. The Rewilding Institute, there's actually a Rewilding Institute. There are three C's, or cores, corridors, and carnivores. I think some of those tie to, there's another C, connectivity. We're looking to restore kind of the corridor for sea otters moving up the coast so that they can function in their habitats. But this comes up a lot with land-based restorations where our highways and other human activities cut off the corridors for species that need to move around. So we need to think about how we manage the world and the impact we have on it, and how we can coexist within it. So the synergistic approaches of looking at kelp and urchins and sea stars and sea otters, we need to look at all that in combination and see if we can find some ways forward. We think our little sea otter reintroduction discussions will help advance those bigger ideas. So just talking about next steps. As I mentioned, there's this National Environmental Policy Act. A lot of steps to it. You don't have to look at this in too great a detail, a lot of decision points, but basically most of this can be wiped out. We know that sea otter reintroduction is going to have a significant impact on the ecosystems and on some livelihoods of people along the coast. So yes, there'll be a significant impact, and we just need to get to this little, this little strip of activities. This is going to take us enough time and probably a huge amount of resources, but the first part of that, of the National Environmental Policy Act, involves public scoping, a process called scoping. So that's what we'd like to see the Fish and Wildlife Service initiate and start a public discourse about reintroducing sea otters. And then where are we going to get these animals? We can capture them from the wild. This isn't specifically a sea otter capture enterprise. It's a little picture of a research project. But or do we look at surrogate reared animals? These are animals that come in from the wild, separated from their mothers, or abandoned or orphaned by their mothers, and actually we determine that they can be reared successfully and reintroduced to the wild. And so enough animals come in every year that we think that could be a substantial part of the population that could be reintroduced up the coast. And just this surrogacy program at the Monterey Bay Aquarium has started this and been running it for about 20 years. Surrogacy works. A number of publications. This is one of the key ones that came out that over a period of about 15 years, sea otters were reared in the surrogacy program, sort of raised by hand by people for a while, given to a female from the sea otter exhibit to adopt and raise as her own, and then weaned from that animal then being reintroduced to an area as part of this project in Elkhorn Slough, inland from the central part of Monterey Bay. And those animals did well and reproduced, and all sorts of good things happened. And we also need to look at release site selection. Do we look at protected estuaries like this picture of Elkhorn Slough on the left, or do we release animals in the open ocean where they're more likely to maybe expand up the coastline? A lot of decisions to be made about how to proceed. And just a few photos of, from releasing a surrogate reared animal. As I mentioned, these animals learn how to forage. They settle in to an area like Elkhorn Slough, do quite well, reproduce. And the bonus is the slough is pretty stagnant when we started this project. And now it's along with some other restoration work with seagrass. But here's an animal in healthy seagrass beds. And in estuaries, seagrass functions much like the kelp does out in the ocean, open ocean. It's a great nursery ground for all sorts of creatures, and provides other benefits as well. So our one big experiment of reintroducing sea otters to Elkhorn Slough was successful and helpful. And I mentioned coexistence and stakeholder engagement, all the people involved. We live very close to these animals. The proximity of humans who want to be on the coastline and animals who live along the coastline are going to come into contact and potential conflict, and we need to address how that happens, and maybe encourage people to do things differently. And Heather mentioned Sea Otter Savvy, fostering awareness and encouraging people not to cause disturbance to sea otters, because repeated disturbance, particularly to a species like sea otter, the sea otter can be quite harmful. And but just in general, to promote responsible wildlife viewing. How can we coexist with these animals, enjoy them, get good views of them, but not disturb them, not harm them? It's challenging but doable. Another group that sort of has grown up here in Central California is Respect Wildlife. Just happens to have a picture of the North Harbor in Moss Landing at Elkhorn Slough, with kayakers being respectful and passing by a raft of sea otters. And then this is a silly slide again, but the thing that we haven't touched on and we have no time to touch on, but the whole socioeconomic aspect of this will have to be addressed. What are the benefits and conflicts, negative impacts, economic opportunities that will come from a sea otter reintroduction? We're going to address it a little bit in our project this year, but by the time we're done in February of next year, we won't have really dealt with this very much. That's something for the future, but we will have to get into that, because that will determine in large measure whether or not we can proceed, I think. So in terms of defenders of wildlife and sea otter reintroduction, I'll just mention we've got kind of 4 key areas. We talk about coexistence. The project we're working on definitely checks that. We're really working hard to get people to understand what we're doing and why. The importance of protecting and restoring habitats. A lot of people have to be involved in these discussions and decisions, and ultimately we want to restore and protect species that otherwise aren't going to do well if we don't take a hand. So if you want more information, we'll be posting occasional updates on this project, but other sea otter information on our Sea Otter Facebook group. I think we'll be posting some links and probably have been in the chat. So check out our Facebook group. We post maybe weekly. We're smack dab in the middle of Sea Otter Awareness Week. Got some more things coming up, but this project that we're talking about with Sea Otter Reintroduction, I think is really is a defining project for this idea of restoring missing links. Sea otters and their vital role are really missing in a lot of areas where they used to be, and we'd like to see them return. You can also go and check out spots along the coast, up in Oregon even, and down through California, some areas where natural history museums or other organizations will be out along the coastline, or perhaps in a zoo or aquarium with a viewing station. So you can check out some of the links that are being posted to find out where to go for those. Some of these spots will have spotting scopes and people with information, so you can see and learn about sea otters. And I'll make one last pitch for the California Sea Otter Voluntary Tax Contribution Fund. If you're a California taxpayer, line 410 on that form allows you to chip in some dough for sea otter conservation work. And just real quick, tomorrow, I mentioned this panel discussion talking about sea otters and aquaculture. We're trying to engage with the fishing community and have some open and honest discussions about what sea otter reintroduction would mean. There's a chance tomorrow at noon to hear some folks speaking on that subject. So check that out. And then tomorrow, late afternoon, Annabelle Beichman is extremely bright person working on sea otter genomics, and she's going to talk for the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Association and about sea otter genomes. Pretty cool stuff. And ultimately, our little pitch to the Fish and Wildlife Service. I've got this little guy, allow me to reintroduce myself. So we think that sea otters deserve this chance, so we can help them progress up the coastline, expand their range, help out with the restoration of coastal communities and ecosystems. And I think we'll all be better off for it. So we'll turn it over back to Jacqueline. I probably used all the Q&A time, but maybe some folks are still on, and we can address any questions you might have. So thank you very much.
Yeah, that was great, Andy. We definitely have people still on, so I'm going to pop in some questions. The first one that we got, or one of the ones that we got in the chat, was, do winter rains like we had this year affect the sea otters?
Well, the answer is definitely. They don't think I don't think they mind too much when a little rain falls on them, but it's really that aspect of huge inputs of stormwater runoff into the ocean. Back when we had in times when we had wildfires along the Central Coast, we saw effects of a lot of the ash washing into the ocean, and they were actually able to measure in the DNA of the animal, or genes of the animal, changes as a result of coming into contact with some of that runoff. But we do see a lot of pathogens and pollutants that wash into the ocean. You've probably heard about toxoplasma that is expelled from cats, both wild cats and domestic cats, and gets washed into the nearshore ecosystem, gets concentrated by the shellfish and consumed by the sea otters. That is quite a harmful organism to sea otters. We see other parasites and things that tend to get into the system. And then when we see a lot of runoff from agricultural chemicals, those tend to, fertilizers, which we use on land, they then go into the ocean, sort of fertilize some of the algae that overgrows. So these harmful algal blooms we see associated with a lot of chemical runoff, as well as warming waters. Those blooms tend to produce toxins that similarly get into both fish and shellfish. We see impacts of these harmful chemicals that get into that the California sea lions, for instance, feed on, that get concentrated in things like sardines. And we see it in sea otters when they eat the concentrated. They get a sort of a bolus of these toxins, and it can be quite harmful. So often we look at these storms that we might have, and maybe a little time passes, and then you start seeing increases in disease and animals showing up with intoxications or disease or whatever. So it's so yes.
Yeah, and in many ways it sounds like. And we have maybe time for just one more question. Is that all right with you, Andy?
Yeah, I mean, what we do, one more, and then folks are welcome to take off. It's not a captive audience, but if we have a few other questions, we'll stay on and answer.
Okay, great. Yeah, let's. We do have a couple of questions. So, I think this one you could answer fairly quickly. When and who documented the abalone washing up on the beach in Mendocino County? Can we provide that information?
I can't. Who did I talk to about that? I'm sure there's been media coverage on that.
Sure.
But I think it was a fisherman up in that area who was just sort of, lamenting the harm that's happened to these nearshore areas.
Sure. Sure. So to the fishery points, we have a question. How or what are you going to sorry, I'm trying to read this here. What's being done to solve conflicts within the fisheries industry?
Yeah, as you might imagine, it's a complicated issue. The fishing industry, for a variety of reasons that it's too long to get into, but they lost a lot of trust in the Fish and Wildlife Service with some agreements that didn't pan out well. And they certainly, there are issues with conservation organizations and fisheries that a lot of times conservation groups are maybe on the other side of a particular issue. I think at the broadest scale, I think all of us would agree that the nearshore ecosystem in California and northward has been severely harmed, and we need to think about that bigger picture issue. Otherwise, there won't be any fisheries anyway. Sea otter reintroduction as a concept isn't going to solve all the nearshore problems, but it could help. And we think that in the past, it's just been total confrontation. It's like, we want to do this with sea otters, and the fisheries have said, we don't want this to happen with sea otters. And we're just trying to find a new way. We're trying to say, let's talk about some of these bigger global issues about what's really important to save these ecosystems. And then maybe we can talk about, well, if we did reintroduce sea otters, where could we release them where we'd have less impact, and where would there be less impact or no impact for a longer period of time, depending on where we release animals. And are there opportunities maybe where some fishers might say, well, maybe the writing's on the wall a bit. Are there opportunities for me to pursue something else? And a lot of these folks are extremely invested in that lifestyle and in their traditions with fishing. But I think we can have some discussions about that. We need to also speak with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and say, maybe we don't keep issuing, more permits for this particular fishery, or maybe we do need to control limits of some of these fisheries, so we don't place so much stress, But they do have a point, the shell fisheries, that generally, if sea otters move into an area, commercial fishing generally is not also possible. The commercial aspect only came about because sea otters were hunted to local extinction in these areas. So at any rate, we just want to converse rather than immediately go to our corners and have a squabble. There are bigger issues at stake, we think.
Totally. I'm going to try my best with this question. I'm not sure that it's worded great. Will the otters be reintroduced into a habituation period? To have a habituation period?
Yeah, we're talking about a lot about that right now. That as I mentioned, the idea in the past has been, we'll get a bunch of otters and throw them someplace. Interestingly, with the surrogacy program at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, these pups that came in, they didn't really have a history anywhere. So when we put them into Elkhorn Slough, they didn't think, I don't want to be here, I'm going to swim back to where I used to be. So they tended to stay where they were. So I think we have that advantage going for us with that procedure. But generally, I think we need to do a better job of acclimating, habituating these animals to new areas, with maybe put them in net pens or in enclosed embayments, let them establish themselves a little bit, and instead of just dropping them off and bailing out. We also need to track and monitor the animals intensively, which wasn't often done in some of these past issues. And there's one other point I wanted to make about that. And if the discussion, if habituation was more tending toward the coexistence question, you know, I think sea otters living in the near shore have become pretty habituated to people. I think that would happen if they move to a new area, areas around Monterey and what we call these sort of disturbance hotspots like Moss Landing Harbor, Monterey Harbor, the Cannery Row area, Morro Bay, where people get too close to sea otters and do disturb them. I think if we learn just to step back a little bit, that the disturbance doesn't happen. Everyone can enjoy the sea otters aren't harmed, and we can proceed. But so anyway, tons of issues and lots of thinking needs to be done.
Sure. Are there other locations that otters, I'm going to rephrase this, that otters need to be reduced or that we can introduce them to?
Sorry, areas that we think that they should go particularly?
That we're not looking at right now.
Yeah, I think that's like the big, it's almost like a chicken and egg question. It's everything sort of depends on where we want to release otters, in terms of what impacts will be, what benefits there will be. But we need to do a lot of work to determine which areas will be best. So I think top priority is where are they going to be successful? Where ecologically can they fit in and thrive? That might be in concert with you know, kelp restoration efforts or something like that, so they have some protection when they first arrive in kelp. But again, a lot of discussion needs to happen about that to sort that out, and a lot of that is going to stem from some of this mathematical modeling that you know, if you release so many sea otters you know, per year for so many years into this area that the data sets show is particularly good for sea otters, you know, we should see this type of population growth and maybe expansion into adjacent areas. But it's not an exact science. It's going to take a lot of work for sure, and a fair amount of money. Hopefully not as much as has been spent on other programs like condors and whatever else. But I think a lot of folks are keen to work on this. A lot of momentum is building and so forth. I just like quickly, I saw one question come from Grant Downey, who I know is a fisherman up in Fort Bragg, and I don't know if he had a follow up on anything or if that's seeable.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I thought you were going to read the questions.
Yeah,
Grant's question is, if sea otters create healthy kelp habitat, why is there a sea urchin barren problem on the central coast where sea otters have been present for 100 years?
Yeah, you know, a good and complicated question. I think, I mean, from what I've seen, at least this past summer, kelp has rebounded quite a bit. We've seen that sea otters, and I'm not trying to say that, hey, it's actually, you know, great in areas where sea otters are and terrible where they aren't. But I think it's, you know, none of these things happen immediately. And I think what we saw in the region where there are sea otters in Central California is at least pockets of one of the researchers who did a study on this called them mosaics. So areas of urchin barren, but also area where kelp persisted, and the sea otters were able to, I think, from what I saw, particularly this year, start to see the kelp starting to expand again in these areas. The really interesting thing, and Grant knows tons more about this than I do, but when the sea urchins lost their food source, which is the kelp, and these urchin barrens are created, I almost can't get my head around it, but the urchins become, you know, dormant, almost like people call them zombie urchins, where there's really nothing inside the test of the urchin, that they're just sort of sitting there waiting for some point in the future when they'll have food again. I can't believe that they live, but obviously that's not something that a sea otter can feed on. So if we throw a bunch of sea otters in areas where they're urchin barrens, they aren't going to solve the problem immediately. I think it's like a creeping effect that would happen. But again, a lot more science and understanding will have to happen about that. But it's a question that needs to be addressed for sure.
Great. I think those are all of our questions, but one good one is, how can people support the effort?
Yeah, I think at the risk of repeating myself, the tax fund is sitting there waiting to absorb cash during tax season and whenever. But I think in projects like this, when I was at the Monterey Bay Aquarium and currently, but when we were going full bore with the Sea Otter Surrogacy program, we had many volunteers who participated in field research, in otter tracking, in otter rehabilitation work, caring for sea otter pups and so forth. That's just like a small part of this big project, and it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of volunteer time, a lot of staff time. I think there'll be a lot of opportunities to get involved. And a big part of this current project we're working on is to try to get out and start reaching out and engaging with new communities, certainly with tribal communities, and we're just trying to get a strategy to have some better engagement with the fishing communities, and I think if things progress, there'll be much more opportunity for public engagement, public comment periods that the Fish and Wildlife Service will have to go through, but then chances to get involved. I mean, if the Monterey Bay Aquarium was able to track sea otters in Elkhorn Slough because it's 15 miles away, but if animals move hundreds of miles up the coast or are moved up there, there'll have to be people from those local communities to be involved and care and participate in all of the activities that are going on. So stay tuned, because I think a lot of interesting stuff is going to be coming out there.
Yeah, well, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Andy and Heather. Guys, I put in the chat for everybody just a real quick reminder of the We Were Here survey from Sea Otter Savvy and the Sea Otter Awareness Week webpage. Thanks for everybody for coming out and being on the chat. This was a really awesome, engaging thing. And we'll just, if you guys have any questions, I believe we have our emails on the invite. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Thanks, everybody.